All in Sports Network. We love sports.
It is Wednesday, November 6th on All In Horns, your daily fix for all things Texas Longhorns, brought to you by Rogue Sports Network. I'm Tanner Carlson, along with Jake Jimerson. We have a jam-packed show for you today as the Texas Longhorns prepare to host the Florida Gators coming into town in Austin this Saturday. We are going to go over the keys to victory. We're going to talk the Texas-Florida matchup and kind of scouting Florida and how they're looking so far, whether that be defensively, offensively. We're going to take a little look at the future schedule of the Texas Longhorns and non-conference games that just announced that the Texas Longhorns have scheduled for the 28-29 seasons. They will have a home and home with Notre Dame. We're going to dive in to that a little bit as well. And Jake, the bye week is gone. We're halfway through prep week for Florida. Injury reports are coming out. People are starting to, kind of get more prepared. This team is ready. Sark has talked to the press multiple times, as we've mentioned in our previous episode this week on Tuesday. But Jake, what's kind of your feeling here early on, or I guess midway through the prep week of Florida Gators coming into Austin?
You know what's kind of stood out to me is from the team and from Sarkisian. After the Vanderbilt win, I think Sarkisian tries to be positive coming off a win when he talks in the pressers immediately following a game. And then the week after, you start to hear some of his honest thoughts after he's had time to review the game, review the film, kind of review what happened within the game. And you're hearing some more things just sprinkled in here or there. And sometimes you have to listen to some of those small details he mentions in a conference, in a press conference, because those are what really speak to what he's thinking. And you've kind of heard him say, we've been off for a couple weeks. Things haven't looked like they should in the last few weeks. And so he's including that Vanderbilt game in it, and maybe even some of that Oklahoma game, at least the start in it. And so I think it's a coaching staff and a team that's pretty hungry to get back out in the field and try to show what they're capable of. And kind of draw that line between, you don't want to play tight because you're like, we gotta show out now, but playing loose, playing confident more than anything. And then having that play on the field kind of show what you see in practice and show what they've shown earlier in the year. I think their goal is not only to probably win Saturday, but to show how dominant they can be, because they haven't showed that in a few weeks now.
Yeah, and I think that is going to be important, regardless of there being 12 teams and more teams get elected into the college football postseason now. I think even having a little bit of a, your eye test, if you will, like we saw with the BCS and like we've seen with the 14 committee, is that you are going to have to show that you are one of the best teams in the country. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons why Texas got into the playoffs last year over a Florida State, over a not over a one-loss Alabama, but we're ranked ahead Alabama. Also, the head-to-head win didn't hurt by any means. But Texas, by the last 2-3 weeks of the regular season, even into conference championship week against Oklahoma State, looked and felt like they were one of the 4 best teams in the country. Now, yes, you can do that with, one of the best 12 teams in the country. Sure, maybe the stakes aren't as high, but seeding will matter. Having a home game in that first round of the playoffs, if you don't get a first round bye, will matter if you don't win your conference. And so I think Sark is really starting to hone that in to the team. I think the coaching staff is starting to understand it as well. And this team, Jake, this team knows how good they are. I think they are very well aware of the possibility of where this team can go and the potential that it has, whether that be making the SEC championship game, winning the SEC championship, being one of those top 4 teams in the playoffs, and then making a run to a national championship. I think this team understands they have a very rare opportunity in doing that. They just need to go out there and show it. And that's one thing that they necessarily haven't done on a consistent basis. I think they're looking to turn that around against a vulnerable Florida team.
Yeah, and maybe not even that on a consistent basis. It's really just been the recent. I mean, it's been the last two games where they, OU, it didn't look beautiful, but they still ended up winning in a complete blowout and covering a large spread in a rivalry game that we both mentioned that we were worried about going into it. But Vanderbilt, the score on the scoreboard did not show what the box score showed, and that is a problem because you don't win games in the box score, you win them on the scoreboard, and it doesn't matter how much you outgain a team if you end up losing that game or almost losing that game in the case of Vanderbilt where it was just way too close to be comfortable. And so I think they're trying to show some of the dominance they've shown on the field, but get that to reflect in the scoreboard like it was earlier in the year. It's not like, as good as they looked against Michigan might be the one game that is the outlier as far as they didn't really look bad at any point in that game. The second half, they slowed it down as more of just a running approach. But in pretty much all the other games, you saw some vulnerabilities here and there, but you see that in pretty much every team in the country. But the scoreboard always looked like it should at the end of the game. And against Vanderbilt, the box score and as far as the play on the field, other than penalties and turnovers, looked similar to most other games this year. They looked like the much better team. They kind of dominated Vanderbilt, but at the end of the day, they won by 3 points.
The biggest lie told in college sports, in my opinion, is, stats don't lie. Well, stats can very much lie. We've seen time and time again, really throughout even this regular season, whether that be Arkansas, their early game against, who was it, Oklahoma State, in which they lost. Yeah. I mean, they dominated that game. Those stats, if you just looked at the box score and you guessed what the final score was, you would assume that Arkansas would have blown Oklahoma State out by 30 points. Well, they ended up losing that game. So the box score does deceive you from time to time. Now, all Texas needs to do is match what they're putting up in the box score and the stat sheet and match on the scoreboard, which is what you're saying, to your point.
Yeah. And just look cleaner. I think that's kind of also been an emphasis, we mentioned on yesterday's episode about the goal being, they've really worked hard during the bye week on coaching up penalties. The problem with that is you can coach it all you want, but it has to show up on Saturday. And that's a player thing, because you can coach it. You can say not to hold. You can say, hey, I know some of these aren't holds, but you're just going to really have to focus on hand placement. Don't give them any reason to throw a flag. Especially on some of the special team stuff that we've seen. And then the pre-snap stuff, the linemen doing push-ups now for any false start that's happening in practice and adding on to those push-ups each day that goes on. They're taking steps to try to mitigate these penalties that haven't necessarily been a terrible issue all year, but have really shown up in the last couple of weeks, especially. And that's something that can cost you a game at Arkansas or at A&M or even against a very feisty, to say the least, Florida team who just gave Georgia a run for their money, gave Tennessee a run for their money earlier in this year. And really, Florida has been a team that's been getting better each and every week. And so I think the focus has been more internally for the Texas team of, okay, the best possibility for us to lose is if we beat us. And the Vanderbilt game showed that. So how do we reduce the chances of that happening? Got to clean up penalties, and then you got to clean up turnovers. Even if a couple of them were fluky, you still have turned over the ball fairly consistently this year. The turnover margin isn't what it should be for how many turnovers the defense has forced. And so I think they're going to be looking to play a much cleaner game this Saturday is what I think the big goal will be for the team.
Kelvin Banks does not do push-ups. He pushes the earth down. Let's go ahead and take a look, Jake, at this future schedule for the Texas Longhorns. Just announcing they've got a home-and-home scheduled matchup between Notre Dame in 2028 and 2029, some other future non-conference games. Starting off with at Ohio State next year, should be one of Arch Manning's first career starts, but as a going into the offseason next season as a starter, week 2 or week 3, I think they're planning
if
on
I'm not wrong,
that.
it's week 1.
Oh, is
I
it
believe
week 1?
It's week
okay.
1 from what, if I recall correctly, it's week 1.
And then also you will then flip home field advantage the following season in 2026. And that'll be in Austin against Ohio State, and then get back on track with Michigan with what you started earlier this year in 2027 with a home game in Austin against the Wolverines. That program could look completely. I don't know what Michigan's going to look like in 3 years. I mean, they could be significantly better. They could have blown the whole thing up by now, and they could be a dumpster fire. We've seen both versions of that program really within the last 20 years. So, Jake, this Notre Dame home and home in 2028, 2029, the significance of scheduling these types of teams in your non-conference where you already play in the SEC, what are, to me, it's a significant advantage, regardless if you're getting computer ratings or whatever you can say. I always just will result back to the Texas-Alabama game is what put Texas in the playoffs in the Final 14 playoffs last year.
Yeah, I think last year is the perfect example of why you do this. And yes, that was with Texas in the Big 12, but with the 12-team playoff being created, I actually think it should influence these teams to make harder non-conference games, especially in the SEC where you currently play one less game. There is rumblings that could change and they could add a ninth conference game to be like every other conference, which I would be for. But I still think you schedule tough out of conference games because with the 12-team playoff, that strength of schedule metric could get you in if you lose 3 games in a season in the future. It definitely is going to get you in if you only lose 2 games. And so you get to learn a little bit about your team early on. If you win that game, I feel like that win just ends up looking great at the end of the year, no matter what. Just like you look at Notre Dame beating A&M, that win is going to hold up really strong for them. And even though they lost to Northern Illinois, if they get into the playoffs, that's going to be their marquee win this year, is going to College Station. Even if it was week 1, even if that A&M team does look a lot different now than they did then, it doesn't matter in the eyes of the committee. They went to A&M and they won that game, just like Alabama looked like a better football team at the towards the latter half of last year than they did early in the season when they lost to Texas. Didn't matter. Texas went to Tuscaloosa and won that game. But if you lose that game and you start looking a lot better at the end of the season, I don't think they view that as such a bad thing because it's a good loss. I don't think there's such a thing as a good loss, but in a playoff committee era, there just is. Blatantly, as a matter of fact, there is.
Well, and then let's talk about, too, there's other aspects to this as well, of not just the eye test or having a good loss or strength of schedule or whatever within the eyes of the committee. Jake, there are tiebreakers within your own conference now that solely rely on strength of schedule, strength of opponent record, things of that nature. And so when you're scheduling teams like an Ohio State, that's only going to elevate your tie-breaking stances of maybe you end the same conference record as a Tennessee for that third, second spot, and that could be the difference at some point in time. I'm not saying any of these games are going to have that implication, but it could going into the end of one of these seasons, whether or not Texas or Tennessee or Ole Miss or whoever one of these teams are getting into the SEC championship game. Also, recruiting. How big of it is to have this marquee game. These games are probably going to be tops of the list, Jake, of College Game Day, Big Noon Kickoff. You name the pregame show. You name the amount of media and coverage that's going to cover these games, and the amount of eyeballs watching these games. You make a couple big plays. You have a couple big games within these games. If you're a big-time recruit or wanting to be a big-time recruit, and you're currently getting recruited by one of these programs, you're more likely to go play for Texas, who's going to schedule Ohio State in week 1 rather than playing, for an Oklahoma who's going to schedule Maine, in their non-conference games.
Yeah. And last year is the perfect example of it because of the fact Alabama was getting in. You couldn't put them in and not put Texas in. And then on your recruiting standpoint, it guarantees you a game, especially when you have a home one, obviously, that you are guaranteed to have a huge marquee game where you're going to want to invite a bunch of recruits, because there may be a year where Texas doesn't get a Georgia or an Alabama in Austin. Obviously, with the A&M game, that is a added bonus of adding A&M to the schedule, is you get that game in Austin, because with that's kind of the weird thing with the Texas OU game, is it being in Dallas versus in Austin. I'd be curious to learn how those official visits go versus when you have one for a game that's in Austin. But it adds so much without really losing much, because you can still put in those tune-up games. And I'm happy that Chris Del Conte kind of has this philosophy of, we're going to schedule at least one marquee non-conference game every year. And he has held true to that. And I don't see why that would change as long as he's the athletic director at Texas, which I think we both hope is for a very, very long time.
And there's a revenue side of this thing too, Jake. Let's not, beat around the bush. I mean, when you get Ohio State and Texas on the same playing field, there's some money involved, whether that be sponsors, ticket sales, merchandise sales, media sales, anything
And
that
for
you
the whole
want to.
city,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
small businesses in the
Tourist
area,
attractions. Yeah.
you get increased employment for that week. I mean, it's a good thing for the city. It's a good thing for the campus. It's a good thing for the excitement. And then obviously the money side of things works its way out when it comes to tickets, hotels, Airbnbs, you
All
name it.
those things. Yeah. Jake, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this Florida team. What are some things that have caught your eye, at least early on in the scouting process?
Well, early on, I've just kind of been looking at the defense. I'm very focused on the Texas offense this week, as I talked about yesterday, because I want to see them kind of get going again, get the confidence back, get the mojo going. And Florida presents some issues, I think, for Texas this week on the defensive side of the ball. They're very young, but they're very talented. They've gotten better every single week. Don't go back and watch the Miami film. There's just no point. This is a much
It's a
better
completely
defensive
different team.
football team than and also Miami is a pretty damn good offense. As we've learned, say what you want about that team, their offense is really, really good.
Yeah.
And I would say probably the best offense in college football this year. But I think schematically is where I'm very interested to see this game play out, because Florida likes to kind of press up at the line of scrimmage with their defensive backs, have their two safeties deep, and then show different blitz pressures with the linebackers coming up. Obviously, some are going to blitz, some are not. And so they're really going to try to confuse the offensive line. That is when Vanderbilt got pressure. That is when Georgia got pressure, is with a lot of these disguises. Obviously, Florida is not as good as Georgia's defense, but at the same time, neither was Vanderbilt. I think Florida has a better defense than Vanderbilt. And I'm very curious to see if this offensive line can hold up in pass protection, because I thought that they had been one of the best pass blocking units ever at Texas. In the last 2 weeks, that has just not been the case.
Well, Jake, and also I want to point out, and yes, this was a big time rivalry between these two programs in Florida and Georgia. But I think Florida's defense is the sole reason why they were even in that game at any point in time. And they had players going down. They had to show the depth, which isn't nearly as deep as, say, a Georgia, an Alabama, a Texas within their own conference. But this Florida team, they showed a lot of heart within that Georgia game, with the amount of injuries that kept piling up and guys that just didn't quit and kept playing hard. I think what I was most impressed in, and you'll see this in my keys to victory as well, just a little foreshadowing, is how well this secondary for Florida tackled in space against Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, they did not miss many tackles, and just the athleticness of the team as well. This is where you see a little bit of a difference between the Big 12 and the SEC, is one thing that stood out to me. You look at Florida up front on defense, you look at the size and the speed and the tackling of their secondary. This is a 500 football team. It's a little different than playing against a TCU. Even in Iowa State and Oklahoma State, they have more size and speed. Now, they might not be as well coached as some of those teams I just mentioned. There are differences. But you look at what Florida did to UCF earlier this year, and that's kind of a middle of the pack Big 12 team. You see the difference between the conferences, I think, in this type of matchup. And that's why it's a little scary to me, is just because I think the coaches are really going to challenge the players on physicalness this weekend, even though they're not playing A&M. It's not Arkansas. It's not Georgia. It's not Michigan even. That's still a very fast, athletic, and physical team. And on the defensive line, they're huge and they're surprisingly quick as well.
Yeah.
And so I think the key is going to be, this is where the offensive line needs to come out and show that the Vanderbilt game was a little bit of a fluke, because other than the Georgia game, the Vanderbilt game I actually think the Vanderbilt game was just their worst performance of the season as an offensive line unit, because when you consider the level of competition they were going against. So I think it needs to be a big bounce back week for them, but I think Florida's pretty damn good up front.
I mean, Jake, and a lot of that, we've mentioned it before on the show before, is that a lot of O-line and offensive mistakes, whether that be penalties or whatever, or quick pressures up the middle, a lot of it's communication. You had a bye week to figure that out. Now, here's for me, Texas can come out one of two ways out of the bye week. They can come out looking like South Carolina against Texas A&M and shore up whatever issues they had going into it, whether that was a close loss to Alabama, nearly beating LSU, and just saying enough is enough. We're going to put a full performance to the best of our potential coming out of the bye week because we're going to work on the mistakes that hurt us in those games. You can either come out like that or you can come out looking like Clemson, completely lost, have no idea, and lay a complete egg coming out of a bye week against an inferior opponent at home and get beat by Louisville, in this case, Florida.
Yeah. And part of this goes to the running backs, by the way, to expand on what I was saying. The running back pass protection, you can tell that's where you can tell CJ Baxter is missed even more than in just the standard handoff running game, which you can tell that he is missed, by the way, just because that depth. Also, he was very much set to have a big year too, but the pass protection from the running backs, they've probably caused just as many sacks, if not more, than the offensive line.
As the season has progressed, speaking on the running game, you can tell through the attrition that these running backs have gathered, the wear and tear on their body is starting to catch up to themselves as the season progresses. That's why the body count of the running back group getting hurt and decimated before the season even started was a main concern, why it was such an issue. CJ Baxter now, man, if you just had that extra body with his talent and his skill, a Trey Wisner would be invaluable in a game like this. A Jaden Blue would be invaluable in a game like this, but those guys are already worn out. They're tired. They're the attrition of getting beat each and every single game, whether that would just be running the ball or whatever it is starting to take its toll on your lower end depth of the running back position.
And it kind of speaks to why I think Sarkisian's been hesitant to have a game where he just fully commits to the run. I don't think he feels they're in a position to do that. And I don't think it's because he doesn't think they can run the ball successfully. It's because if you lose another running back, you're kind of screwed. All of a sudden you might have to be putting a Niblet in. And don't forget, Gibson, Blue, and Wisner have all missed games or missed practices or played very banged up this year. That's your last three running backs on this roster that
and we haven't really
seen touch the field.
We haven't seen a lot of Gibson in the last 2-3 weeks.
And because of that, we may see more of him. Sarkisian mentioned him in the presser. And when Sarkisian mentions a name in the presser, that typically means you're going to see it over the weekend.
Yeah.
And so I think Gibson's going to get some carries this week because you need him to. He, as bad as he is in the passing game, and he provides little to nothing in the passing game, you need someone to hand the ball off to and just take some of those carries away from Blue and Wisner because they talked about it during the bye week. If Texas is going to meet their goals, this is the halfway point of the season, which is wild to think about just how much longer this playoff system adds to the season, especially if you play in a conference championship game too.
You play in a conference championship game, and if you lose that conference championship game, it is more detrimental than not playing in the conference championship and getting into the playoffs. You kind of get a secret bye week in that case to kind of get healthy and rest up. Now, if you get in the conference championship, you win the conference championship, you get further into the playoff round, you have less playoff games to play, and you get a bye week following it. So obviously there are reasons you want to win your conference, duh. But losing it, I think, is way more detrimental than not even going to the conference championship, but still being allowed to make the playoffs, being a 1 or 2 loss team. Jake, before we get any further into the scouting, I don't want to miss our opportunity to jump in to our keys to victory. Let's go ahead and jump there. We did some scouting. Tomorrow's episode, we will dive deeper into this Texas-Florida matchup, and then we'll also give our predictions on Friday, as we always do. We'll go through Saturday's slate of games. Keys to victory, Jake, for Saturday's game against Florida.
I'm very offensively focused, and you're going to see it in my keys to victory because
Jake,
trust
can I ask you real quick? Yeah, okay. Can I? I'm just going to ask you real quick. The reason why you're focusing so much on the offense is because it's not that we don't respect the Florida offense because they are a big play offense. It's more so because we respect the Texas defense to get the job done so much. Is that?
Yeah, I have said it for a couple weeks now that I think this is the best defense in the country. Does that mean they're going to play every game perfectly and only allow 10 points a game the rest of the way through? No, They may have a game where they give up 24, 27 points, and that's okay as long as your offense plays to the level that Sarkisian has set as a standard, which is scoring more than 30 points at a bare minimum. That is an expectation. When Texas doesn't score under 30, or if Texas scores under 30 points in a game, I consider it a complete failure at this point. Call it spoiled because it is, but that is the expectation that has been set. I think the defense is proven at this point, and so I'm all about watching how this offense looks this weekend because they need to get it right. To do that, number one, this is going to be very obvious. Limit the penalties, especially pre-snap and on early downs. Every single time it feels like Texas puts themselves in a hole, and all of a sudden it's 2nd and 12, 2nd and 10, 2nd and 7+. Or if you get to a 3rd and 1 and then you commit a false start, and all of a sudden a 3rd and 1 goes to 3rd and 6. Those are just back-breaking penalties that at this level of college football lose you games, and almost lost them a game last week. The second one is going to be get the run game going. See the first point. What helps the run game get going? When you get a 20-yard run, don't hold, especially a hold that has no bearance on the play. Some of that is somehow we need to talk the officials into not calling phantom holding calls on pancakes. And I'm not sure how to do that because there was a lot of that in the Vanderbilt game. But at the same time, Texas has run the ball successfully in the Oklahoma game, obviously, was the best one of the season. And then in the Vanderbilt game, if they just don't commit penalties on so many of the big runs, they would average 5-6 yards a carry.
Dude, the running game I thought looked really, really good against Vanderbilt. It just was every single big play, whether that was a 15-yard gain or even a 3rd and 1 and they gained 5 or 6 yards, it was taken back immediately by a holding penalty. Some real, some phantom.
And then what happens? Then you got to throw the football and throw it in an obvious situation. That's when the defense can pin their ears back, try to confuse, and then kind of take advantage of the running backs and pass protection, which brings me to my third point. The intermediate passing game needs to get going, which means your blitz pickup needs to be on point, your communication at the offensive line, your running back pass pro, your tight end pass pro, all of that just needs to be in sync. And that is really not to name a boy band here, but that is the goal for the Texas offense this weekend. Be in sync, or you can throw some Backstreet Boys in there. They need to be back this weekend.
They just need to go in one direction, and that's towards the end zone.
God. Yeah, we need to stop this. All the people listening are hitting the X button right now.
They've now logged off. Yeah.
But those are my keys. Like I said, offense.
I like that. I see what you did there. And I think, any football knowing fan would also see what you did with your keys to victory. One leads into the other. One plays off to the other. Whichever you could go 3-2-1 and it would still, cycle through the way it's supposed to be played in terms of complementary football, not complementary football in the traditional term of offense supporting the defense. When the defense gets turnovers, the offense put points on the board. Special teams gets a good play. They put your offense in good field position. You capitalize on points with that, so on and so forth. But and more so complementary in a more minute sense of the word, a more micro version of the word, which within your own side of the football. Offensive line needs to be complementary to the running backs. The running backs need to be complementary to the passing game. The passing game needs to be complementary to the offensive line, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, all the position groups need to be in sync with each other. And that is something that has really always been the case under Steve Sarkisian. And it's kind of odd that a team this talented and with a lot of experience is kind of having some of these struggles that they're having. And that's why I'm fairly confident they're going to clean it up. And I think we'll start to see that this week.
All right. My keys to victory, Jake, is take this one seriously. Take this Florida team very seriously. I've said it in yesterday's episode. I said it. I touched on it slightly in today's episode. Billy Napier has this team believing, and it showed a lot in that Georgia game. When DJ Lagway went down, you thought, here come the floodgates. Georgia's about to dominate this game. No, the transfer from Yale came in as a redshirt freshman and played extremely well considering the spot that he was in, playing against the team that he was in the game setting of Florida, Georgia, that he found himself in. Played very well. The defense played inspired. This team is playing confident, inspired football, and it's a completely different team than what we saw in the first 4 weeks of the season. Don't go back and say, oh, well, Miami killed them. Oh, Texas A&M killed them. I don't think those games can – I don't think you can hold a match to the games that were played in the first 4 weeks of the season compared to the last 4 games that they have played up to this point. I think it's a completely different football team, and they're playing much more inspired football, whether that be for the team, whether that be for themselves, whether that be for their teammates, whether that be for the coach. It doesn't matter, but Billy Napier has this team believing, and I think you have to absolutely go into this game taking this team seriously. That's first and foremost. Number 2, you got to break tackles in open space. I talked about it earlier in this episode, how well I thought the Florida defense tackled the Georgia offensive skill positions in open space, also getting to Carson Beck as well in open space. They took care of Trevor Etienne fairly well, a very good running back and a running back who transferred from Florida. It was kind of a revenge game for him, but also a revenge game for the Florida defense. But also getting those Georgia wide receivers down in space. I thought they did really good in tackling when it came to the screen game, which is something that Texas absolutely relies on to have successful offense. If you can make a couple of those guys miss in open space, that should allow your team to move the ball efficiently down the field. And then on the defensive side of the ball, the first defensive key to victory for either one of us, first time we've even mentioned defense in this episode, take away the big play. I don't care if it's DJ Lagway playing. We talked about it in yesterday's episode that whether or not he is playing, they haven't announced whether or not he is the starter or not the starter. I think it's a little smoke and mirrors. That's a little bit of gamesmanship on Billy Napier's part. He's allowed to do that. However, if Lagway does play, he is a big play guy. He's capable. He's got a hell of an arm. He can launch it down the field. And I think as long as the defense forces this Florida offense to drive down the ball, the more plays Florida runs on the offensive side of the ball, the more likely Texas can capitalize on a mistake. And that's just kind of how I feel about it. But if they let them go down the field 2, 3, 4 plays at a time and they're just getting chunk play after chunk play, Texas could find themselves on their heels a little bit in this one. But Jake, those are my keys to victory. And so if Texas follows those 6 steps, they should find themselves to a 21.5-point lead and a victory over Florida. How do you feel about that spread?
I'm curious how they get the half point, but no, it again, I've said this in a lot of games this season. I guess this is just part of being a good football team. Again, because I'm still not used to seeing these spreads. We didn't even see spreads like this last year.
They're nervous.
That's a big spread against a football team that, if you look since that A&M game, which was their last really bad performance of the season, they handled Mississippi State with ease on the road. Granted, Mississippi State was playing worse then than they are now. They handled UCF at home, who hasn't been as good as expected this season, but still at that point in the season, not a bad win for Florida. Then they lost in overtime at Tennessee. They throttled Kentucky, scored 48 points on a good Kentucky defense. And then they lost a 2-possession game that was really a 1-possession, as far as it was a very close game late into the fourth quarter against Georgia. So they're 2-2 in their last 4, with essentially 2 1-possession losses to top 10 teams. And it's a 21.5-point spread. So does that tell you that I'm not very confident as far as the spread being that large in this game?
Florida is also 5-3 against the spread this year, Jake. So they more times than not they cover or exceed and get straight up the money line as well. So lastly, before we log off, there was a very just humorous, a humorous, what do you call them? I don't ever get on them very much. The boards, the message boards. Yeah, the message boards. I don't get on them for Texas. I don't get on. It's just crazy fans talking crazy stuff. But I think one key to victory, Jake, since we're on the topic of it, as Texas moves further and further down the season, that final game in College Station, I think one thing that Texas absolutely has to do to make sure that they have success against that just stifling front 7 of Texas A&M is to lube up and to wear Vaseline. And if they wear enough Vaseline, they're not going to be able to wrap up Texas. And so I think that is one thing that Texas absolutely has to do to find success, whether that be trying to sack Quinn Ewers or run the ball with the running backs, and also have perfect ball security while also covered in Vaseline.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, I'm going to read the post. There was a great post at message board geniuses on Twitter, and every fan base has it. Believe me, the Texas boards are not much better. But this post was too funny not to mention. A person that goes by the name of Waldo Wings on Tex Ags
tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah. Watching last night, I don't ever remember seeing so many plays where the ball carrier just slips out of our grasp. I don't remember anything like that where we saw at any level aside from what we used to see out of Johnny. It definitely looked like the uniforms were just very hard to hold on to. Surely not shenanigans like the link below. And then he posts a 1997, which tells you how old this guy is, of the Broncos caught spraying their uniforms with silicone. And then someone who goes by the hashtag MKE, who's also a proud Texas Ag Billy Lucci member, says, I was honestly wondering the same thing. It's like their players were covered in lube. And so we have a little bit of a lube gate from the 44 to 20. If their players just weren't lubed, they wouldn't have lost by 24 points.
It's a real shame that they were lubed up. Maybe they prefer it a little bit more raw. They would have, done a little bit better of a job tackling and getting inside the hole of the defense.
My only question is, did he do it?
Yeah. Did he do it? Did he not do it? Didn't do it? Did he? Texas A&M fans, absolutely ridiculous. And I know that's not the vast majority of them. Well, it might be. I know it's just this one guy on a message board from what we know of, and the guy who also supported it. But we just thought it was too funny not to bring up, Jake. But that is going to do it for our show today. The Texas Longhorns take on the Florida Gators. Those are our keys to victory. In tomorrow's episode, we're going to go in a more detailed look at what the scouting looks like and matchups and things that we like. In terms of more Texas talk and favoring against Florida, whether that be offensively or defensively. And then on Friday, we will give you our prediction episode, and we will talk more about the Saturday slate of games. And as always, Saturday's episode will remain our immediate reaction following the game. Win, lose, Texas' immediate reaction will be right here on All In Horns as we give you this content Monday through Friday, dropping at noon each and every single day. It's your daily fix for all things Texas Longhorns, brought to you by Rogue Sports Network. I'm Tanner Carlson. That is Jake Jimerson. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, welcome.
All in Sports Network. We love sports.